When J. Robert Oppenheimer was 21, he placed an apple laced with toxic chemicals on the desk of his physics tutor. The tutor, Patrick Blackett, was an experimentalist, and he had hounded Robert to do more of what he thought Robert wasn't very good at: experimental work. Oppenheimer had already been spending his days in a corner of J.J. Thomson's basement laboratory, attempting to make thin films of beryllium, which were used to study electrons. But Oppenheimer was clumsy and not good at this work. He was soon avoiding his duties in the lab, spending his time listening to lectures and reading physics journals. It was 1925, and the 21-year-old Oppenheimer was becoming fascinated by the new field of quantum mechanics. Despite being surrounded by brilliant physicists like Rutherford and Chadwick, Oppenheimer was deeply unhappy. He wrote, "I'm having a pretty bad time. The lab work is a terrible bore, and I'm so bad at it that it's impossible to feel that I'm learning anything." A friend walked in on him lying on the floor of his room, which he called a miserable hole, groaning and rolling from side to side in emotional anguish. It was in this state that Robert attempted to poison Blackett. The specifics are lost to history. There are conflicting reports if Oppenheimer used cyanide or something he found in the lab which would have just made Blackett sick. This story sounds unbelievable, but Oppenheimer himself confirmed it. Luckily, Blackett did not eat the apple, but the attempted poisoning became known to the Cambridge University authorities. Robert's parents were visiting their son from the US at the time, and Julius Oppenheimer successfully lobbied Cambridge not to press criminal charges. Due to his family's wealth, Robert wasn't even expelled from Cambridge, on the condition that he had periodic counseling sessions with a psychiatrist in London. When Oppenheimer was 23, he graduated with his PhD in physics. He wrote his thesis in German on the quantum theory of continuous spectra. All in all, he published more than a dozen papers in the 2 years he was at Göttingen. Many of them expanded upon the work of Werner Heisenberg, who was just 3 years older than Oppenheimer. The two eventually met in 1927, the same year Heisenberg published his groundbreaking paper on the quantum uncertainty principle. By all accounts, the pair got along well. There was no way to know that just 15 years later, they would be deadly rivals, attempting to build the first nuclear bomb, Oppenheimer for the USA and Heisenberg for Nazi Germany. On the 18th of September 1942, General Leslie Groves was put in charge of the Manhattan Project.
I was responsible for the development of the atomic bomb.
On day one, he ordered 1,200 tons of uranium ore. The next day, he ordered to buy the Oak Ridge site, where the ore would be refined. The next month, in a surprising move, he chose Oppenheimer to be the science director of the soon-to-be-established Los Alamos Laboratory. Oppenheimer had just been selected to be the chief architect of the atomic bomb. The military establishment had concerns. Oppenheimer did not have a Nobel Prize, so would the scientists hired for the project respect his opinion and follow his leadership? Oppenheimer also had no prior administrative experience over a large project like this. Furthermore, he was a theoretical physicist who, according to Isidore Rabi, was a very impractical fellow. He didn't know anything about equipment. And then there was the problem of Oppenheimer's political stance. He had links to the Communist Party, including his wife Catherine, who was a member of that party. But Groves was impressed by Oppenheimer. He valued his overwhelming ambition. He also knew that Oppenheimer's ability to understand problems not just in physics, but chemistry, engineering, and metallurgy would be invaluable. Groves thought that Oppenheimer was a real genius, saying that, why, Oppenheimer knows about everything. He can talk to you about anything you bring up. Well, not exactly, he doesn't know anything about sports. In 1943, Oppenheimer estimated that he'd need about 6 scientists, supported by a handful of engineers and technicians to make a bomb. He was off by 2 orders of magnitude. 764 scientists would end up working for the Manhattan Project, 302 of which would work at the Los Alamos site. Over 600,000 people in total were involved with the making of the atomic bomb. By this point, making the atom bomb didn't seem impossible, it seemed likely. On the 2nd of December 1942, a team of physicists at the University of Chicago, led by Enrico Fermi, created the world's first artificial nuclear reactor, Pile 1. It consisted of 45 tons of uranium and uranium oxide and 330 tons of graphite blocks. Horrifyingly enough, it was located under the stands of the football field. It generated about half a watt of power. And if you can make a nuclear power plant, you can make a bomb. The only real difference between the two is how many neutrons hit the next atom, causing it to split and release more neutrons. If on average that number is 1, there will be a stable, self-sustaining chain reaction, but it won't grow. If it's less than 1, the reaction will die down. And if it's more than 1, the reaction will grow. This is known as the multiplication factor, K. Nuclear reactions are similar to pandemics in this way. Oppenheimer and the rest of the scientists at Los Alamos needed to act quickly. It was already 1945, and Truman wanted to test the weapon before the start of the Potsdam Conference. That's where Truman, Churchill, and Stalin would come together to plan the post-war peace. The conference began on the 17th of July. The earliest date that everything could be ready for the bomb was just 1 day earlier. So that is when the test was scheduled. It was codenamed Trinity. Perhaps more terrifying than the idea of the bomb not working was that it would work too well. The Trinity test was scheduled for 4 a.m., but it was delayed due to a storm. So at 5:29 and 21 seconds, the Gadget, the world's first nuclear bomb, detonated. The high explosive squeezed the core of plutonium inwards. The shockwave mixed the beryllium and polonium, releasing a flood of neutrons. The Urchin worked. It jump-started the nuclear reaction, and now there was no way to stop it. Just 6 kilograms of plutonium created an explosion that was equivalent to nearly 25,000 tons of TNT. The New Mexico mountains were illuminated brighter than in daytime. The shockwave was felt from over 160 kilometers away. The mushroom cloud rose to 12 kilometers into the sky. It was so hot that the desert sand melted into a glassy mineral now known as trinitite. Fortunately, the blast did not set fire to the atmosphere. On August 6, 1945, the Boeing B-29 Flying Fortress dropped Little Boy, a gun-type nuclear bomb with 64 kilograms of enriched uranium. The nitrocellulose ignited, pushing the slugs of uranium-235 together, tipping it over its critical mass. The blast from the explosion, equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT, killed nearly 70,000 people. Another 70,000 would die from burns and radiation poisoning in the following months. 3 days later, an implosion-type bomb, like the Gadget, was dropped on Nagasaki, killing an estimated 80,000 more people. More than 95% of the 225,000 people killed in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were civilians. Most were women and children. After the war, Oppenheimer was a national hero. His portrait was on the cover of Time magazine, and he became a household name. In 1947, he became the director of the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton. He also became the chairman of the General Advisory Committee, where he became an advisor on nuclear weapons-related issues. He used his position to argue for arms control. In August 1949, the Soviet Union tested their first atomic weapon. And the US military quickly decided that the best course of action was to develop a more powerful bomb, the hydrogen bomb, known as the Super. Oppenheimer was against the development of the Super on ethical grounds, and the worry that it would start an arms race. But Truman's administration pushed through, and 3 years later, Ivy Mike, the first hydrogen bomb, was tested in the Marshall Islands. It had a yield of 10.4 megatons of TNT. That's 400 times more powerful than the Trinity test. In part, due to his opposition to the hydrogen bomb and due to his calls to avert a nuclear arms race, Oppenheimer was essentially put on trial to revoke his security clearance. He had been surveilled while he was working for the Manhattan Project, but that surveillance didn't stop after he left. Many of the wiretaps were illegal and warrantless. Oppenheimer was questioned about his ties to the Communist Party, including his affair with Jean Tatlock, a Communist Party member, while he was leading the Los Alamos lab. He was essentially accused of treason and espionage. In December 1953, Oppenheimer had his security clearance suspended. His face, now grim and in black and white, was once again on the cover of Time. His security hearings were international news.